Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here to be leading this panel discussion with an esteemed group of panelists. Today, we are going to uh, dive into and delve into a very insightful discussion around technology and the African continent and the connection between Africa and its diaspora. Uh, with each African country working through the need to digitize and advance the use of technology, this panel will discuss the need to reduce cyber vulnerability throughout the continent, the introduction of the framework for better regulatory policy, and then governments having the opportunity to increase their revenue, the private sector be able to evolve through the varying different stages of digitizing on through their evolution for their digitalization journey. And then we will discuss varying different topics on how to facilitate public and private sector partnerships. My name is Larry Young. I am COO and senior partner of BNC International. We are the oldest African-American owned uh, global strategy consulting firm in the country. We've been in business for over 60 years. 40 plus of those years, we've spent that as a liaison between the US and varying different African governments. We spent an extensive amount of time on the continent working on business development projects for small and medium-sized businesses and corporations that have aspirations of expanding to the continent of Africa. And conversely, corporations on the continent of Africa that are looking to have a bigger presence here in the US. Under that umbrella, we also work with government agencies to make sure that not just their outreach initiatives in terms of economic development are inclusive, but we also work with them to ensure that the incentive package that are being developed are also responsive in attracting foreign direct investment. Today on the panel with me, we have Kendrall Felder, and I'll allow them to individually introduce themselves as well. But Kendrall Felder is the head of IT and centralized services at Cisco. And we also have Raymond as well. In addition to the panel, where this is going to be a bit untraditional from your typical moderated panel with slides. This is going to be more so of a recorded conversation. I'll be leading with questions and trying to tap into the brains that we have with us today. With that, I'll allow each of them to introduce themselves, and then we can jump right in.
Yeah, I'll go first. Thank you, Larry. That was a good introduction. So my name is Raymond Asiimwe. I'm managing partner at Bytelex Advocates. We are a law firm practicing out of Uganda and Rwanda with affiliates in South Africa, Nigeria, the US, and Kenya. So we do a lot of work for startup companies, startup and high growth tech companies as well. And so anywhere from structuring, helping them think through intellectual property and technology transactions, we assist them with all that. And we've been doing this for quite a bit now. And we've done work for anywhere from a pre-revenue company to post-revenue to those that eventually make it as a unicorn to $1 billion valuation. And yeah, so that's a bit of my introduction.
Wow, Raymond, you're gonna make me follow that? You're gonna leave it on the $1 billion mark? No, in all seriousness, I'm honored to be here with you gentlemen today. Both very impressive backgrounds, smart guys that I have a lot of respect for. So thank you for even including me in this discussion. As Larry alluded to, my name's Kendrall Felder. I run centralized services for IT at Cisco. What that essentially means is all business operations and program management goes through my organization, and we support all of Cisco IT around the world. And as far as my background is concerned, I started my career over 15 years ago in corporate finance, have since then gained experience in corporate strategy, program and product management. I've led large sales teams as well. I've also started a company, invested in other companies. And about 4 years ago, I actually joined Cisco. And during that journey, it's enabled me to work with countries globally to help them understand what their posture is as it relates to cybersecurity policy, but also the technologies that they have deployed across their infrastructure. And with that experience, I was also able to work with several private sector customers, whether they be in banking, whether they be in utilities, or whether they be in telecommunications, doing similar exercises where we look over what their people, processes, and technologies are as it relates to security, has been one of the main pillars of my time here at Cisco. Then I transitioned into a role where I did it internally for the organization, and now I'm in my current role. So excited to be here and talk cybersecurity, digitization across the continent of Africa today, and thanks again for including me.
Well, I think what will be interesting, you know, in comparison to many of the webinars that I've seen, and I know by now we've probably all seen, you know, throughout the course of COVID, we've probably either participated in or watched, you know, literally hundreds of webinars and panel discussions. So I think in regards to this one, it'll be slightly different because I think we'll all have the opportunity to, you know, answer the questions. Again, I think we have smart enough people who are participating to be able to let it kind of flow freely. And you know, being that we all kind of collectively work together, it isn't a panel, even though we come from individual entities. We all have, you know, enterprises and projects that we collaborate on collectively, which is a little bit different from most webinar panels where people are completely separate and many of them don't know each other. So I think for this, the advantage to the listener and to the viewer is that, you know, not only do you have the ability to hear perspectives of people that are very experienced in terms of business and in terms of kind of cross-continental work and how things are done all across the world in terms of business and technology, but you have the ability to you know, collaborate and reach out to us and continue the conversation. So with that, I'll start with, and I'll put this kind of, you know, to the group. You know, what do we see, or what does the group see as kind of the challenges right now to developing Pan-African strategies?
I'll start with a couple, and I'll say them up front, and then I'll dive into each of them. As it relates to Pan-African strategies, I think mutual recognition and collaboration are a big challenge. When you look across alliances globally, whether it be cohorts like the Five Eyes with the US, Canada, et cetera, Australia, New Zealand, so on and so forth, or whether it be the EU, those countries typically work together to figure out, hey, if we do these things in our country, will your country also recognize them as acceptable from a security perspective? And that's been very effective globally. That's why they have those types of alliances. And I think having more focus on that from an African standpoint, I think is going to be key for the continent moving forward, because if that doesn't happen, then what ends up occurring is each country has its own set of rules, which increases the cost of doing business for large companies trying to come to the continent. So we got to get that part figured out, one. And then two, I think the investment into the infrastructure needs to be there. Yes, the usage will continue to rise, but there needs to be a better bandwidth. There needs to be better infrastructure. et cetera, across the continent, so that the accessibility is there, the usability is there, et cetera. So if I had to name two things that are big barriers and challenges right now, I would say mutual recognition and investment.
I think Kendrall raises a couple of interesting points. I'll answer this as a lawyer, again, because of my background. For me, it's how we harmonize these laws. It's been very, very challenging. We talk about the Africa Continental Trade Area, we have the East African Community, we have the Organization of African Unity. They've made a few strategic steps towards, Pan-Africanism, but there's still a long way to go. So we'll find that, we mention in those different treaties what we intend to do, but when you go on a country level, it's something else. We are not playing nice with our neighbors in terms of, harmonization. I'll give you a simple example. If you look at Europe, we have what we call passporting rights. You can practically register in a specific country and then bring all your documents, and they would recognize you very simply in another country. That is something that is really rare here. You're going to go through quite a lot before someone, allows you to even get licenses. So for me, it comes down to, when do we achieve that level of harmonization to achieve that Pan-African strategy? Yeah.
Raymond, harmonization sounds so much better than mutual recognition. That's why you get paid the big bucks.
Yeah.
Well, and I would also say that notion of harmonization, also plays into the idea that there isn't enough capital for informal businesses or small businesses on the continent to reach scale at the speed that they may be able to on other continents. And I think the ability for that capital to be raised in the US is an interesting opportunity, but most kind of investors, whether they are sophisticated investors or just investors that have a certain level of liquidity that's interested in making investments that maybe are in areas of their expertise, but in different parts of the world. When an American investor is thinking about investing in these types of solutions or opportunities on the continent, their lack of awareness on actually how big each country is and how many countries are actually on the continent leads them to first go to, is it a solution that's going to, that just solves a problem in Tanzania, or is it a solution that is going to be able to be scaled across multiple countries? Yeah. And I think those parts to Raymond's point in regards to harmonization of laws, harmonization of practices, it provides an opportunity for not for just the countries to speak similar language, but for them to also be able to differentiate their respective value propositions from one another too. And I doing a lot of business, kind of between countries over the years, and helping businesses determine where is the best place for them to do business. It becomes a challenge when those countries may not always articulate exactly what their competitive advantage is in comparison to another country that might be a potential target.
Yep.
So going from that, and you think about the East African markets that you're in, Raymond, that you mentioned in terms of Rwanda, Uganda, and Kenya, and many others. How should an American investor or American company, look at, the ease of doing business? Because you hear a lot about and the comparisons of the ease of doing business in respective countries. How should American businesses look at it from that perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Larry. So we've taken, and to start with the positives, all these countries have taken exceptional steps to make it easy to do business. We're now seeing one-stop centers, at the border, where you can practically find everything from, your transport and, the visa and so many other services. A few years ago, if you're crossing the border, for instance, you'd have to cross from one side of the border to the other. But now we see that all that is integrated. You have the revenue authorities, you have visa and so on. But then even when you get in the country, they've created most of these one-stop centers where you'll be able to find a lot of everything you'll need, from immigration, from setting up the registration bureaus. All that is in there, which has worked well. And then for some of them, they've taken a step further to integrate and create registries online, so that you can actually go ahead and register all that you need to do. So in Uganda, they've done that so well. Kenya's also done that, and Rwanda. You can now register companies pretty much in Rwanda and Uganda now online. And then, same thing applies for tax registrations. They're trying to make it possible. The challenges still remain in the sense that as much as we've actually made those positive steps in all these countries, in terms of the practice that still exists in implementing some of these technologies, they leave a lot to be desired. Some of them are not friendly. The security on those online platforms is not up there, and we've had a few incidents in some of these countries. But then also for some users that will come from the US and other places, it becomes frustrating sometimes to think through how a platform should work, because it's not that friendly, and because they're not lawyers, or they don't have the knowledge, it becomes even more complicated. So the move should be towards building user platforms that are more friendly and helpful. But then also we note quite a bit the inconsistency in enforcement of regulation, and this cuts across all three countries. You'll find that in some areas regulation is enforced differently or is enforced selectively, and that doesn't pose so well for the business environment for most investors. So that for me is one of the biggest threats and challenges to this.
And I don't know, Kendra, if you wanted to also kind of make a comment on the regulatory aspect that other countries across the world kind of go through in terms of some of the cybersecurity frameworks that are necessary to be able to secure the cyberspace. I don't know if you wanted to make a comment on that.
Yeah. I'll actually start with Raymond's comments. And while I'm not an expert in East African business administration, I concur with the points that he made. And actually, I would say that those things aren't just specific to that region. I think in a lot of developing regions, you find those types of practices, right? Because with the absence of, I fail to come up with the exact word, with the absence of the appropriate infrastructure and incentives, I'll call them, then a lot of times when it gets down to actual enforcement, then to your point, Raymond, it comes a selective process. It's who actually can benefit me best in this particular situation, where if you had the right infrastructure and incentives, then the process would win out. So until these developing regions get those types of infrastructure and incentives in place for people to actually follow the rules, and those incentives can be good or bad, right? They can be benefits or punitive. Until those things are in place, I think you'll continue to see that type of behavior globally. But to that point, Larry, in your question about broader countries, I think what you see oftentimes is in developed countries, you find what I started to call offensive and defensive regulations in place. And by those terms, I mean the more offensive regulations are based around the front end of technology. So how's your hardware constructed? Are you going through certain requirements processes to develop it? Once it's deployed, how often are you rebooting it? Those types of things are preventative, right? And so you look at them as offensive measures. And then on the back end, you have the more defensive elements where you're regulating behaviors of the humans. And so you say, if you behave this way, then this is the result of that. And so you start to see more front end and back end regulatory approaches when you go to the more developed countries globally. But even in those places, right, you still have people who are able to get through certain situations because of nuances and loopholes. So it'll always exist, but I think having that offensive and defensive perspective is something that you see in a lot of developed markets. More developed markets, excuse me.
I think both of you bring a good balance to the conversation in terms of what the African nuances are of these particular topics, and then on the other side, kind of what developed countries are also doing in the same conversation. And to me, that becomes vitally important for African governments in particular to be able to, on a certain level, leapfrog in terms of policy development. The beauty of doing things first, or well, not the beauty, the problem of doing things first is that oftentimes you don't realize, what your blind spots are, because there's no prerequisite for how things are going to be done. Now, Africa may look at itself as or many people around the world may deem Africa to be behind in terms of the regulatory framework around many of these discussions. But at the same time, Africa has the ability, if they're leveraging that information that's already that's out there, and those resources that have those experiences other places, then there's an opportunity for them to avoid some of those mistakes, and not it being a conversation. And as an American, I am extremely sensitive to doing things on the continent with the idea that the continent needs to be westernized. I like to look at, some of the information that I have is more of an opportunity to help the continent modernize instead. So, and in large part, it's why, the people, myself, Kendrall, and Raymond have, decided to work together in terms of many of these conversations of how we can bring, many of the African countries from a governmental perspective and from a private sector perspective, and how they talk to each other, into the fourth industrial revolution that everyone talks about. And we all are extremely passionate about making sure that, Africa and its diaspora has the opportunity to position itself where it needs to be in order to be a powerful piece of this particular industrial revolution. So and that brings me to my next thought, and that is, where do we see the role of Africa's diaspora in Africa's path to digitalization?
Raymond, I'll defer to you on that one to get us kicked off. Hey, you're on mute, sir.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Larry. So one thing to point out, actually a couple of things. If you look at the talent in the diaspora, we look to you sometimes because of the exposure that you have. So for instance, I think it was Kendrall, you mentioned quite a bit how regulated, for instance, the US is, the defensive and the offensive. In most of the emerging markets, that is regulation we are rising up to, that is just beginning to come out. So the experience that we find in those markets is very rich. And so sometimes we look to the diaspora to be involved in, giving us that knowledge transfer. And we look to the skills that we might be able to get from there. But then on the other hand, any of this stuff of, digital transformation or digitization costs money. It really does. That's the most simplest way to put it. So the diaspora can be actively involved, in one way, partnering with these companies down here in Africa, and also those down in Africa partnering with the diaspora to create value on all angles. The exchange of skills from the diaspora, and also, some bit of money from both sides as well, to build solutions that actually make sense. So I think that is something that we look to the diaspora to quite a bit.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you there, Raymond, and you sort of took the words right out of my mouth in terms of being able to provide guidance in terms of what happens in the markets where we reside, right? Whether it's America or the UK or France, being able to bring that know-how back is going to be critical. And then I think that the Diaspora also plays a major part, to your point, in helping to find access to capital, right? Or opportunities for these markets across Africa. And I think one of the things, if I'm being candid, that we have to work on both sides, the Diaspora and the citizens of the continent, is forging more formal relationships with each other and really being more strategic about the opportunities that we have. Because if we look at, to your point about some of the practices, once you get registered in countries, you know, you start to hit barriers when you're trying to drive certain opportunities. And so I think when we come together as Diaspora and again, representatives of these countries talk about what could and should be done, we should move forward as a singular unit, in my opinion, versus us pitching you all or you all pitching us for things. I think we need to be more strategic as a unit as we move forward. But I do see that as an opportunity. But I think you hit it spot on in terms of the know-how and the investment opportunities.
I think both of you are absolutely correct in that regard. I did some research for a paper that I wrote last year around kind of the traditional impediments to African Americans or Black people in the U.S. with investing on the continent. And one of the things that I noticed, through going through census data, was that in the U.S., Chinese Americans, for example, do considerable business in China. Mexican Americans do considerable business in Mexico, and partly because they're able to tap into their direct family members and give them insight and information on cultural nuances and things to do in the marketplace, or legal representation and things of that nature, and that's understandable. And as Black people in the U.S., we may not necessarily be able to contact someone in our family, direct family per se, on the continent. But when you think about it from context, we're not just trying to connect with one country. We have the ability to connect with an entire continent of people who have that belong to the kind of same social uniform, if you will, that we belong to. And I think that becomes a major opportunity to break down the barriers that exist and the separatism that exists quite naturally between, Africa's diaspora in the U.S. or in Europe or in Canada or in, the Caribbean. I like to tell people that, Black is Black, no matter where you are across the world. And I think that if we have the ability to do that and letting business, if you will, and economics be that bridge, then it gives us the ability to really leverage the buying power that everybody likes to quote, right, in the U.S., or be able to leverage the population size that everybody likes to quote when they're talking about the continent. It really doesn't matter how big you are or how much wealth you have access to, if you're not actually using it to move the needle in terms of, closing that racial wealth gap that we all talk about. And there's nothing like the pandemic that we're in that shows, how disparities that we've always known existed can really determine whether or not you live or die, or whether or not your kids are being educated, or whether or not you have the ability to, not work, or in terms of, being able to work from home and things of that nature, and your access to the internet. So I think those are a lot of interesting perspectives in terms of kind of why we should be working together. and I know Raymond probably has some ideas of how we should be working together, and Kendrall mentioned it as well in terms of us collaborating. But from a structural perspective, Raymond, kind of what are your thoughts around
so
businesses?
Larry, you mentioned a couple of points in there, and so the structure that we've always thought about is you need to move from a point where it is uncertain to maybe risk to a point where someone can now see some bit of uncertainty, because if they know certainty or can handle the risk. For most people, doing work on the continent has seemed very risky for them. So a huge job for us on this panel, and for anyone that is listening that is interested, is to make sure that it isn't as risky to do work on the continent. And without being so general about this, how would you do that? Strategically prepare workflows that make sense. Prepare documents or templates that make sense, that have been used over and over again, that have been used for financings and that worked so successfully amidst any risk that there might have been. De-risk the process in such a way that someone knows that they can get work done within 2 or 3 days. I think a lot of the work in Africa gets attacked quite a bit because someone will commission a consultant. That's the best example I can give, and then they won't hear from them in quite a bit. Maybe it will take weeks and weeks before anything gets done. So how do you move from that position to being able to deliver within 1 or 2 days or less? So if you can achieve that level of certainty, that level of delivering to the diaspora, then you can be able to make it easy for the diaspora to get involved. And there's a couple of structures here. So technology is very important here. Being able to put all those processes, productizing how you deliver the services can go a long way to make sure that this is done right.
So I guess, to the floor, is government a enabler of this work, or is government a prohibitor to this work on the continent right now?
So I think a big, it's 50-50, but there's so many use cases and studies we've seen. I mean, we've seen Tunisia and Morocco, they've put together a very interesting platform called Diaspora. They are, doing so well with that. They're engaging the diaspora, and it's already working for them.
Right.
Other countries have taken steps forward to just centralize the ecosystem on some platform to make it easy for an investor or someone in the diaspora to be able to easily access the ecosystem. So where that has been done, we've seen some bit of results, and we think it's just some of the steps forward. But on the other end, and that's why I say it's 50-50, even ecosystem players or people in these countries play a very, very big role. Some of these things are more of a reputational risk. You want to be sure that even the founders down here or the people that run these countries, step up to deliver, to perform as required. So that's where the other 50% would go. Kendrall, please.
Yeah. It's funny that you said 50-50, because my response to Larry was going to be that they're both, right? And they can be both. And to the points that you made about them being enablers, I think setting up alliances and forums, capital groups that help drive investment, drive visibility and exposure are great things for governments to do. In addition to that, when you think about how you create special economic zones or tax incentives for countries to do foreign direct investment, or for entrepreneurs to launch businesses in your country, are other ways that countries can be enablers. On the other side, I think one of the unintended consequences that you have of government is just a compilation of people, right? It's made up of humans. And so when you get humans, you get human error or human behavior. And a lot of times that leads to behavior that's not necessarily conducive to driving business globally or even developing your economy. And so, and those situations where people end up behaving in a way that's not conducive, you end up with government being a barrier. And so I think you see that in some places across the continent, which then leads to fair or unfair branding of certain places. And I think that's all overcomable, though, with the types of strategies that we talked about with the last question, in terms of figuring out where the opportunities are for the respective countries, what resources and capital are needed, and then collaborating with the appropriate diaspora globally, and leveraging the resources within the respective countries, I think are ways to get around where governments can be barriers. But to the original question, I think it could be both.
But you know, in terms of, and a follow up to that, right? If you think about, you know, a good way to overcome those barriers, it brings you back to, you know, the technology part. And as the private sector is now, you know, COVID-19 again is shown how fast the private sector can go full to technology advancement, right? Whether they were looking at doing things before the pandemic, or if the pandemic kind of accelerated that activity, or if it was just part of the course for them to justify things that they were already doing. I think the challenge on the continent is government moving at the same pace as the private sector in terms of technology utilization and technology advancement, and, you know, moving from analog paper filing to, you know, different kind of ways of controlling and managing and being transparent with data. So I think with that as the next, you know, kind of question, you know, how are you guys individually working with African governments to ensure that they are moving at the pace that technology in the world is requiring them to move?
Yeah, I'll start. So first off, that's a very tricky question to give specifics. To give specifics about the violating confidentiality agreements. I'd like to keep my job.
Don't let anyone know where the bodies are buried.
Right.
But so I think to your point, and what we notice is regulation usually takes quite a bit to catch up with, you know, technology. So a lot of the markets we've done work for have struggled with this. One sector, for instance, fintech, is a very interesting sector for us because we've seen founders. I was on a call with a founder yesterday, and he said, look, in my experience, and this is a very seasoned founder, they've done so well, they've exited a company, they now built a really other big company. I won't get into who they are, but they say, if you wait for regulation to catch up in fintech, they never will. So I'll just do my job anyway, develop my platform, and that's it. So they don't care what the regulation says. If the regulator comes knocking on the door, they'll figure it out then. That's how it thinks. And then the reason for that is, well, the regulators don't quite pick up on, and because technology keeps moving a little faster, even when you try to regulate. And a very good example is, we have what we call sandboxes here. So they'll create, you know, a sandbox to allow you to test your solution. But again, it's been attacked because it has that gatekeeper mentality. You feel like there's a gatekeeper that allows you to use that sandbox in the first place. So for us, our experience has been that there's a move to regulate, but sometimes that is not necessarily the best thing to do. Sometimes, and I think I like this quite a bit from, you know, the US and some countries, where they will sit back, see how, you know, things turn out, and then they regulate when there's really a risk. For most of the countries that we've done work for, we feel there's over-regulation or the lack of regulation thereof, but it's not well thought out sometimes. Sometimes it's an issue of, sitting back and waiting to see what might happen. And then if it does happen, then maybe you think of the risk at that point, and then you achieve that. And most countries, certain countries are excelling at this. So for instance, one country that comes to mind is Rwanda, that, welcomed a drone company that at the time was not welcomed elsewhere across the world, because it was very risky for them. They were not sure what they were going to do, but they allowed them, and they created this performance-based regulation that just encourages them to do whatever they're doing, and then to assess the threat or risk as and when it happens, and then fix that when it really happens. So that's been my experience.
Yeah, you make some great points there, Raymond. From my perspective, I agree. Regulation can be a barrier to doing business. On the flip side of it, I think there could be industry created around regulation, private sector industry, but then also not necessarily from a regulatory perspective, but still being government driven. I think that the government has an opportunity to create business development programs, right? That requires investment, that requires capital, going back to issues we called out previously. But I think governments have an opportunity to influence business in that way as well. I.e., here in America, you see every political campaign or political cycle, you hear people talk about bringing jobs back to America, right? That's the type of influence government can have on the economy. But as it relates to governments there in particular, when I think about cybersecurity regulation, I've seen here in the States, I've seen in other countries globally, where because of the rules that have been put into place, there's a need for people to drive attestation to those rules, to ensure the compliance, or to drive assurance for companies as it relates to whether it's ISO 27001 or common criteria, or you name the regulation. There are actual companies set up around those regulations to drive that compliance. And so while I see the valid points of regulations sometimes being a barrier to doing business, it can also create an entire industry. And I'll leave this question with this last example. If we go into a country, and I've seen this in places globally, if we go into a country and that government has decided we're going to enforce X, Y, and Z things, that means the private sector has to follow suit, right? And the private sector likely has to change some of their processes, but they also likely have to hire people to fill roles that drive that compliance, right? And then you think about the skilling of those people that need to be hired. That's an opportunity for higher education or for training companies to come in and set up shop to drive the necessary knowledge and know-how into those individuals that can then go sit in the private sector to keep those companies compliant with government regulation. So I see it as a spectrum. It can be a barrier, it can be an economy starter or driver, but it just depends on how you look at it in the case that we're talking about.
Yeah, and maybe let me just add something really small to Kendrall's point. You quickly realize that there's a delicate balance here. I mean, on the one end, it could be a barrier to technologies cropping up. On another, you need the regulation, to be able to create, a new industry altogether. So it's a very delicate balance, and if a regulator can determine what that balance might be, then there's really a chance for that digitization process in Africa.
Well, I think McKinsey did a report not too long ago that said, I think the right foundation and the internet will generate like over $300 billion on the continent of Africa per year by 2025, right? So if you think about that, and what Africa, the continent, has done very well is one of the things that I do is in terms of some of my work with government and where that intersects with bringing businesses to the continent is the understanding of what that impact is going to be, to jobs, for example. And some of the projects I've done in South Africa, if I say, hey, I'm interested in bringing a manufacturing facility to South Africa, what does that look like in terms of impact on the economy? And they're able to say, well, for every one job, it's going to create 5 indirect jobs, in their supply chain, through their logistics and supply chain for South Africa. Or they'll be able to say, we know that every person for every person that creates a salary, that salary is covering probably the salary of maybe 3 or 4, a household that has 3 or 4 people in it. So when you're able to think about, to Kendral's point, how you're able to create industries and actually create jobs through the work that you're doing with technology, it does become the equalizer, where some may say, oh, well, AI is going to come in and technology is going to come in and it's going to take jobs away. If you redefine what job creation is through that lens, you actually realize that no, technology is actually bringing in more jobs. And as Africa's population continues to grow at the pace that it is, being, really the only continent that's probably going to triple its youth population, while all of us are still alive, and already has an average age of almost under 20, right, across the continent, you're going to find that Africa is in dire need of industries to create jobs really quickly in order to stay with the pace of population. Because if not, you're going to end up with a lot of people unemployed. And because the 4th industrial revolution is completely unforgiving if you don't have technology skills, you're going to find a gap that we're not able to make up, or at least with my brain, I can't see us being able to close the gap globally in terms of wealth without technology. Now that doesn't mean that if you're a business, you have to have a technology business. But if you have a business that's not using technology, you're probably not going to be in business very long, right? So, I know we're probably coming up on time, and I'll give kind of everyone the opportunity to kind of give a final thought. Yeah.
So, thanks, Larry. One of the things that we're passionate about as a team here at ByteLex is, as you can tell, lawyers are usually risk averse and very cautious, very, very cautious. We are attacked for that. But the testament we have from some of our clients, and this is something that most of them keep telling us, is we usually don't get in the way of their dreams, and we live by that. Even when you look at the firm's vision, we're building radical ideas. We try to think of the best way to build it without stepping on a few regulatory toes. And I think solutions should be going down that path. If we are to push for Africa's digital growth or digital development, we need more men, more entities, people that can collaborate and come together and figure out solutions that can enable these companies grow in such a way that you're balancing the regulation on one hand, but on the other, helping them think through how they scale and grow. And I'm very happy that working with you, Larry, and our other partners, very soon we will be able to do that under a sandbox that we will be doing.
Good.
Yeah, my closing thought is to drive inspiration, right? And for me, when I look at the continent of Africa and I compare it to some of the other places where I've done work globally, to Larry's point, there's no other continent or countries that have the resources, the human resources that Africa will have over the next 20 to 50 years. From a human resources perspective, and last time I checked, humans create processes, humans create money, humans are the creators. No other region has the human resources that the continent of Africa will have for the foreseeable future. And so it's in our hands to equip ourselves in a way where we can build the proper infrastructure, where we can go raise the appropriate capital to invest so that we can get an economy in place that thrives, right? And so whether it's creating industry around compliance or cybersecurity or digitization in general, that's, as Larry called out, the fourth industrial revolution. And those who are equipped will benefit greatly from it. Those who aren't will not. And our ability to equip the people on the continent of Africa is sitting here on this call and amongst our networks. And so we'd love to speak with people about how they're facing and transitioning into digitization. If you're already there, how you're driving cybersecurity, or how you're actually driving your workflows and processes. But we have experience across the gamut. Would love to engage and collaborate. And remember, we're all in this together, because as Larry called it out earlier, we all wear that same uniform regardless of where we sit in the world. So again, I'll end it on inspiration and hope to speak with you all soon.
Appreciate that, both of those responses. And for my final thought, you know, you hear a lot of the phrase that Africa is the dark continent, and you know, even if you Google it, right, you'll find a lot of times you'll see a picture of the world at nighttime, and obviously the U.S. is full of lights, and Europe is full of lights, and Australia is full of lights, and Africa is dark, right? And some people make that comment as with a negative connotation to it. Yeah. But for me and for you know, Kendrall and Raymond and many others within our ecosystems, we know that without the lights on, you have to have a certain level of ingenuity to be able to survive, yeah. Right? And that requirement that most Africans are born with, whether they know that whether they're tapping into it or not, or they have the resources to scale things or not, you know, that's where solutions are made. That's where innovations are born. And the reason that I feel very strongly and have, you know, committed a lot of time with continuing the legacy of our firm at BNC and even in my individual pursuits, where I'm a part of an executive co-founding team with Kendrall, who we've kind of developed and organized a technology firm. It's going to focus on Africa and the digitalization of Africa, and us collaborating with Vitalex and its ecosystem to make sure that you know, we understand the very different cultural nuances. We have executives that are African Diaspora, and we have executives that are Native African on our team, to make sure that we have diversity of thought. But the idea that Africa and its diaspora can work together to collaborate to identify global solutions and solutions for the continent and solutions that exist to problems throughout the world is something that you know, I'm very excited about, and I'm excited to work with people who can also get excited about that. I think there's a great opportunity for governments on the continent. I think it's a great opportunity for private sectors on the continent to be able to go on this journey of technology together and leverage it for the benefit of everybody. Leverage it for the benefit of creating a new narrative for us all. Leverage it for the benefit of being able to untap growth and to bring increased transparency and better programs and better services and better resources to those that need it most. And when I'm thinking of underserved people, I'm thinking of Black people. And as I said before, I think Black is Black. So, you know, we are all, you know, in the same group. I find enjoyment for years. I've been taking Black people in the U.S. to Africa on their first trips. And I personally get a kick out of seeing them on the continent for the first time and having conversations with people on the continent for the first time and realizing that the pain that they felt from slavery or the pain that they felt from colonialism and all of those types of things are the same. And on the flip side, the aspirations that they have for their families and the goals that they have for their families are also all the same. And through that commonality, we've always been able to get things done. We've always been able to be logical and get things done. So again, I extend the opportunity, just as the other panelists whom we all collaborate together on projects, that you reach out to us. You become a part of our ecosystem, and together our ecosystem develops the trust that will enable us to actually do business. Even if the pandemic lasts forever and we can never travel again, we still have the trust associated with being able to get things done across the water without as much money. So again, I thank everyone for participating, for being a part of this panel. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I've definitely enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to speaking to many of you soon.
Thank you.